Jake Morrison had been delivering pizzas in Beverly Hills for 2 years, navigating mansion driveways while saving money for college. But the order to 1847 Sunset Boulevard would change everything. When the door opened, a distinguished man in an expensive suit stared at Jake with an expression of shock and recognition. "You can't be my son," he whispered before slamming the door. Jake stood there holding a pepperoni pizza, staring at the man who had given him up for adoption 20 years ago and was now worth millions. The California sun was setting behind the palm trees as Jake Morrison loaded his beat-up Honda Civic with pizza delivery bags for the evening shift. At 22, he had been working for Tony's Pizza for 2 years, earning money to pay for his community college classes and support himself in his small studio apartment in North Hollywood. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than most jobs available to someone with only a high school education and big dreams. Jake had grown up in the foster care system after being placed for adoption as an infant. His adoptive parents, the Morrisons, had been kind but overwhelmed people who'd taken in several foster children over the years. They'd given Jake their last name and a stable home, but emotional connection had always been difficult. When Jake aged out of the system at 18, he'd been largely on his own, working various jobs while trying to figure out his future. The one thing that had always haunted Jake was the mystery of his biological parents. His adoption records were sealed, and the little information he'd been given was vague. Young parents who couldn't provide for a child, a difficult decision made out of love rather than abandonment. Jake had sometimes fantasized about meeting them, imagining tearful reunions and explanations that would make sense of his feelings of not quite belonging anywhere. The pizza order that evening seemed routine enough. Large pepperoni to 1847 Sunset Boulevard in Beverly Hills. Jake knew the address would be expensive. Beverly Hills deliveries usually meant good tips from wealthy customers who barely noticed the cost of a $20 pizza. He loaded the thermal bag and drove his Honda through the increasingly upscale neighborhoods, past manicured lawns and security gates that reminded him of the gap between his world and theirs. 1847 Sunset Boulevard was a mansion that took Jake's breath away. The Mediterranean-style estate sat behind ornate iron gates, with a circular driveway leading to a front entrance that looked like something from a movie set. Perfectly maintained landscaping, fountain in the courtyard, luxury cars parked under a covered portico. This was wealth on a level Jake had only seen from the outside. He parked his Honda next to a gleaming Mercedes and walked up the marble steps, pizza bag in hand, feeling distinctly out of place in his Tony's Pizza uniform. The massive front door was solid wood with stained glass panels, the kind of entrance that probably cost more than Jake made in a year. Jake rang the doorbell and heard elegant chimes echo through what sounded like a very large house. Footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal a man who made Jake's world stop spinning. The customer was in his late 40s, distinguished and clearly successful, wearing an expensive suit even at home in the evening. But what made Jake's breath catch wasn't the man's obvious wealth, it was his face. The same green eyes Jake saw in the mirror every morning. The same strong jawline, the same slightly cleft chin, the same way of tilting his head when surprised. The man stared at Jake with an expression that went through several phases in rapid succession. Mild interest, surprise, shock, and then something that looked like terror. "Pizza delivery," Jake managed to say, though his voice came out smaller than intended. The man's face went completely white. His hands, which had been reaching for his wallet, began to shake visibly. "There must be some mistake," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Large pepperoni for this address," Jake said, checking his receipt. Are you okay, sir?" The man stepped backward, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "You can't be my son," he whispered, as if speaking to himself rather than to Jake. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "What did you say?" "Nothing. I said nothing." The man's voice was stronger now, but Jake could see panic in his eyes. "There's been a mistake. I didn't order any pizza." "But, sir, the order clearly shows." "I said there's been a mistake." The man's voice rose, and he began closing the door. "You need to leave. Now." "Wait," Jake said, putting his hand against the door to stop it from closing. "Did you just say I was your son?" "I don't know what you're talking about." But the man's denial was contradicted by the tears that had begun forming in his eyes. "Please leave my property. You know who I am, don't you?" Jake pressed. "I can see it in your face. You recognize me." "I don't have a son," the man said firmly, but his voice was shaking. "I've never had children." Jake stared at this man who looked like an older, more successful version of himself. Every instinct told him this was his biological father, but the man's desperate denial was devastating. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The door slammed shut with finality, leaving Jake standing on the marble steps, holding a pizza that nobody wanted, staring at an entrance that had just closed on what might have been the most important moment of his life. Jake stood there for several minutes, his mind reeling. The resemblance hadn't been his imagination, it was undeniable. And the man's reaction, his specific words about Jake being his son, proved that recognition had been mutual. Finally, Jake walked back to his car and sat in the driver's seat, trying to process what had just happened. He pulled out his phone and Googled the address, looking for information about who lived there. The search results made his stomach drop. 1847, Sunset Boulevard was owned by Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, one of California's largest tech companies. Net worth estimated at over $100 million. The photos showed the same man who had just denied Jake's existence. Jake sat in his car outside the mansion for another hour, hoping the man might come back out, might reconsider, might be willing to have a conversation. But the house remained closed to him, its gates and wealth and secrets locked away from a pizza delivery driver who had accidentally discovered his own origin story. Over the next few days, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He researched Richard Sterling obsessively, learning about his business success, his charitable foundation, his public speeches about family values, and supporting youth programs. Nowhere in Sterling's public profile was there any mention of children. Jake also began investigating his own adoption records with new determination. Armed with a potential name and location, he contacted lawyers who specialized in sealed adoption cases, explaining his situation and asking about his options. The lawyer, Patricia Chun, was sympathetic but cautious. "Even if this man is your biological father, he clearly doesn't want contact. Legally, you can't force a relationship. But," she added, "if you can prove paternity, there might be other avenues to explore, especially if there are any irregularities in the adoption process." Jake decided to take a DNA test and see if he could find any other genetic relatives who might provide answers. He also began making deliveries to Sterling's neighborhood more frequently, hoping for another chance encounter. 2 weeks later, opportunity presented itself in an unexpected way. Jake was delivering to a house 3 blocks from Sterling's mansion when he saw the man leaving his driveway in the Mercedes. On impulse, Jake followed at a distance. Sterling drove to an upscale restaurant in West Hollywood, where he met with a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. Jake parked across the street and watched them through the restaurant window, trying to gather courage for what he was about to do. When Sterling and the woman finished their meal and walked outside, Jake approached them. "Mr. Sterling?" Sterling turned, and his face immediately showed the same shock and recognition as before. What are you doing here?" "I think we need to talk," Jake said. "About my adoption. About why you recognized me." The woman looked between them with growing concern. "Richard, who is this?" "Nobody," Sterling said quickly. "Just someone who's been bothering me." But Jake could see the woman studying their faces, noting the obvious resemblance. "Richard," she said slowly, "he looks exactly like you did at that age." "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret. I have photos from when we were in college." The resemblance is unmistakable. Jake looked at the woman with new interest. "You knew him in college?" "I'm his sister," Margaret said. "And if I didn't know better, I'd say you were related to us." Sterling grabbed his sister's arm. "We're leaving. Now." But Margaret pulled away. "Wait. Young man, what's your name?" "Jake Morrison. But I think my birth name might have been different." Margaret's eyes widened. "Morrison? Richard, isn't that the name of the family who—" "Stop," Sterling said desperately. "Don't say another word." "Who adopted your son?" Margaret finished, staring at her brother in shock. "Richard, is this Michael?" Jake felt his world tilt again. "Michael? That was the name we gave you, Margaret said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Before Richard gave you up for adoption. You were named after our grandfather. Sterling looked like he was about to be sick. Margaret, please. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me, she said firmly. Explain to both of us. Standing on a West Hollywood sidewalk under the streetlights, Richard Sterling's carefully constructed life began to unravel. The story came out in fragments, reluctantly, under pressure from his sister and a young man who represented his deepest shame and regret. Jake's mother had been Richard's girlfriend during his senior year at UCLA. Sarah Collins, a pre-med student who had dreams as big as Richard's but less family money to make them reality. When she became pregnant, Richard was already being recruited by tech companies, already envisioning the successful future he would build. I was 22 and selfish, Richard admitted, his voice barely audible. Sarah wanted to keep the baby, wanted us to get married and build a life together. But I had job offers, opportunities that wouldn't wait for me to become a father. Sarah had carried the pregnancy alone while Richard threw himself into his career. When Jake was born, Richard had visited once, just once, to sign the adoption papers and say goodbye to the son he was giving away. I told myself it was best for everyone, Richard continued. Sarah could finish medical school without the burden of raising a child alone. The baby would have a stable family with two parents who actually wanted him, and I could focus on building something meaningful. What happened to my mother? Jake asked. Richard's face crumpled. She died in a car accident 2 years later. I went to her funeral and met your adoptive parents briefly. They seem like good people. I thought you'd be better off not knowing about me. But you've been successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams, Margaret said to her brother. You could have provided for him, could have been part of his life. By then it was too late, Richard said. I was building a company, working 18-hour days. I convinced myself that disrupting his life would be selfish, that he was better off with the family who'd raised him. Jake stared at this man, his biological father, and felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and strange relief at finally knowing the truth. You never wondered about me? Jake asked. Never wanted to know how I turned out? I wondered every day, Richard said quietly. But I also told myself that wondering was my punishment for the choice I made. I didn't deserve to know if you were happy or successful or anything. Margaret looked at her brother with a mixture of disappointment and sympathy. Richard, you could have tried to find him years ago. You could have at least known he was okay. I was afraid, Richard admitted. Afraid he'd hate me. Afraid I disrupted a good life for my own selfish need for absolution. Jake thought about his life, the foster care system, the financial struggles, the years of wondering about his identity. It hadn't been the stable, loving family Richard had imagined. The adoption didn't work out the way you planned, Jake said. My adoptive parents divorced when I was 8. I spent most of my childhood in foster care. Richard's face went white. Oh God. Jake, I'm so sorry. I never knew. How could you know? You never checked. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, processing the weight of 22 years of separation and missed opportunities. What happens now? Margaret asked. Jake looked at Richard, seeing not the successful CEO from magazine covers, but a man carrying decades of guilt and regret. I don't know, Jake said honestly. I spent my whole life wondering about you, imagining different scenarios. I never thought it would be like this. I understand if you hate me, Richard said. I understand if you never want to see me again. Jake considered this. The anger was there, certainly, but there was also relief at finally knowing the truth and something that might eventually become understanding. I don't hate you, Jake said finally, but I also don't know how to have a relationship with someone who denied my existence 2 weeks ago. Would you be willing to try? Richard asked. To start slowly, maybe get to know each other? Maybe, Jake said, but not because you feel guilty, and not because you want to fix 22 years with money or connections. If we do this, it has to be real. Richard nodded. I'd like that. I'd like to know who you've become, despite my failures. 6 months later, Jake was enrolled at UCLA, his tuition paid not as charity, but as what Richard called 22 years of back child support. They met for lunch once a week, Awkward conversations that slowly became easier as they learned to navigate their unusual relationship. Jake still delivered pizzas on weekends, partly because he needed the income, but mostly because he'd learned that sometimes the most important deliveries aren't the ones people order. They're the ones that deliver truth, connection, and second chances to doors that have been closed for far too long. And Richard Sterling learned that success without family is just elaborate loneliness, and that the son he'd given away had grown into exactly the kind of man he'd hoped to become himself. Honest, hardworking, and willing to forgive even the most painful abandonments.